familiar to you if you had an English class or a language arts class in high school. The same things work. And these ones are a lot easier to find, and I would say a lot more fun to find. So we'll start with the one that I think is the most important when you're communicating to somebody, because figurative language is really there to help somebody understand something in a different way. So while the structural ones can maybe emphasize a point or get a point across, or at least just sound good, whereas the diction can change people's mind about something, it can package an idea and make it more palatable. Figurative language is all about communicating in a more understandable way. So analogies are my favorite things to use. So when you're comparing two things, let's say comparing a thing that is harder to understand with something that you know your audience understands. And this is why it's so important to know your audience, because as I mentioned in last Wednesday's lecture, or whenever I posted it, we are constantly code shifting and code switching in using different kinds of ways to explain concepts. And sometimes we're aware of it and sometimes that we're not. So, did I not get that one? That's fine. Metaphor is one of these areas. We know of metaphor and simile. Simile is using like or as, so it's like this thing, whereas metaphor is just making that comparison without it. So going back to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, I'm going to take that same section we looked at with the 100 Years Later. So he's talking about what segregation and being a black person in the U.S. is like. Now, that is understandable to part of his population, but if you think back to the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, I think it's 1963, it was not just people who were black there. There were a lot of people who were white. There were a lot of politicians. It was for many white people really their first exposure to him. Remember, he was not very liked at the time. It's only after his death that he's become this sacred figure to us. So he had a really great opportunity to appeal to more than just his base. And so he had to help them understand how bad this has been. So he chose crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. So we do understand things like manacles. They hold your hands together, or manacles are for your feet. I'm doing great. And chains, those are concrete things that we can envision, And obviously we think of jail. And so talking about segregation and discrimination as, yeah, we may be able to walk around, but actually it's like being in prison. That's how little freedom we have. Is an effective way to get that idea across. Or the following line, the lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity, focusing on just how alone communities that have been ravaged of wealth or systemically not allowed to gain inherited wealth and kept out of certain positions, how they're literally isolated from the rest of the community, even though they can see all around them is all of this wealth that only goes towards certain people. Using an island and an ocean, we understand that. I think even though I'm very clearly not a Trump supporter, and totally fine if you are, this is one of the few moments that I'm going to say, like, that was really smart. His campaign of Drain the Swamp from 2016 was a wonderful way to explain to voters, particularly in the Sun Belt or the American South, his desire to clear corruption from Washington, which corruption in Washington is so vague and so general and so abstract. Regular people don't really understand what that even means or how you do it or why you do it. So he used language that people would understand, that actually carried a really consistent connotation. So especially people in the American South understand the swamps, and they understand, I mean, we, even if we don't live in the American South, understand swamps is like gross and kind of scary, and there's diseases. It's that's where a lot of crocodiles live and stuff like that. And draining, we drain sinks that are dirty, bath water that's dirty. So this idea of we take this dirty thing that can be kind of scary, and we're just gonna like pull the plug on it and clean it out. So all of that's implied, and it worked. People still use this phrase, even though it does not apply now anymore. The swamp's bigger. But I will say, this is one of his finer rhetorical points. We can also have an extended metaphor. So going back to Dr. King, he goes on to talk about sort of why they're there, why Black people are speaking out and organizing in this way, and what they want from the country. And so he used this wonderful extended metaphor of cashing a check. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. So a check, people who are listening, who are hearing him speak, everybody knows that. Granted, you guys have never written a check, or if you have, it's great. I still keep a checkbook, but like I grew up with my mom writing checks everywhere we went, and thank God we don't have to do that anymore. It's a magnificent waste of time. When I worked in retail, I had to take checks. I hated that too. But this would be very, very familiar to people in the 60s. You pay for everything with check. There are no credit cards. And so when you're cashing a check, that's money that's owed to you. It's money that's been given to you. Even though it's just paper, you're going to get that money back. And so he's saying, we've come to get this thing that's owed to us. And he goes on to talk about, like, look, here's what you owed us. You said that we had unalienable rights, Black men as well as white men, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and then brings in promissory notes, which honestly I only really know from Monopoly, but promissory notes, you're borrowing money, and they're saying America is defaulted, like defaulting on a loan. They were supposed to pay us for this, and they have not. So instead, they gave us this bad check. It's marked insufficient funds. So he's not just saying cash a check once, he's going on through here. So if you notice that in yours, you can say there's an extended metaphor and then break it down. Here's why he used this term cash a check. Here's why that would work on his audience. Here's what he was insinuating about America. And I love this part of the Bank of Justice being bankrupt. Anyways. Allusion. Usually these are very small and within a sentence, but allusions are larger metaphors, but usually from a shared knowledge. So you'll see stuff like little phrases from history or the Bible, Greek, Roman mythology, Shakespeare. I think we see some stuff from like Jane Austen now. Any sort of common phrase. I was reading something earlier today about how the Supreme Court will like bring in pop culture references when they're making their statements, and I forgot. I wish I'd pulled out one specifically, but in a sense, they're drawing on these common phrases that hold value to society, and then sprinkling them within their own area. So even if you haven't read the Iliad, most of us know what a Trojan horse is, and we'll say like, oh yeah, that policy was just a Trojan horse. It wasn't literally a Trojan horse. What they're saying is that it is it's something that looks nice on the outside, but once it's put into action or in this area, then then like it's going to become destructive because people come out of it and then kill all of the, kill everyone. So I found this in mine. It was really small, but I found it. It was this phrase, a more perfect union. So talking about why it should be Harriet Tubman who's erected as a statue. And it says she was all these things. It was a woman who helped to bring into being a more perfect union. That's not a phrase we use a lot, but it is directly from the preamble of the Constitution. So it says, we the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union. So that phrase is used intentionally. It's intentionally grabbing at this document that people protect and think is sacred, and then bringing it into your own context. So if you are into American history and you haven't read the declaration that I mentioned before, the Declaration of the Rights of Women, it's actually fantastic because it's almost like a parody of the Constitution, with the Declaration, and they just sort of change it around. But it's meant to carry that ethos and sort of infuse what they're talking about with a little bit of ethos of, look, I know, like, I value patriotism. I value our American history and foundations. I will use the language that our forefathers used. And hopefully you did notice some of this back when we looked at alliteration. We the people. Yep. Anecdotes. Anecdotes work really great. They are totally a pathos appeal, but they can help illustrate something that maybe is a little bit more difficult. So in my article, the whole first three paragraphs are all just this anecdote of him being a kid and going to Monticello and the memorial and hanging around the mall in Washington. And so it's interesting, and you'll notice on my notes that there's a moment where the argument just shifts. He has these three kind of like nice reflections, and all of a sudden he's like, here's why we need to take down that memorial. But there's a lot that happened in this anecdote. He established his ethos. It also made him seem really relatable. You could see that in my notes too, talking about being with his grandma, sort of just a little family trip, hanging out. Maybe you had to go, if you grew up in the States, had to go to certain national monuments or museums and stuff as part of your either field trips or like with your family on family vacations. All of this is very warm and relatable and nice. He's talking from a human being to another human being, and he establishes that before he jumps in to what is a really controversial topic. So if he'd started with that controversy, it's very likely that some people would have just tuned out, but some people may become invested with this person and then listen to what they have to say. So it can be very, very helpful to have anecdotes. So notice in your articles, when does your author maybe sort of break into a story, and why are they doing it? So those of you who are doing the bastard cop one, I mean, there's going to be tons of anecdotes in there, but they're also working as proof. So think about like, cool, what did he show us, and why did he want us to see this specific story? Why did he want us to see this specific scene? Imagery, which comes from the Greek of enargia, which is just descriptive words that use some of that concrete language, that can use connotation also, which evokes pathos, and it helps us identify with the scene. It gives that visual picture for us, which we then are able to connect with it better and understand it better. So I found this this clip in an article when I was at the dentist like a year ago, back in the day when I could do that. And it was all about liposuction, which isn't the thing that I thought I was going to read, but there were not a lot of magazines that were around. And I was trying to stay off of my phone. And it was the most engaging article I've read in a very long time. And that's the marker of a good writer, when you could take a bizarre topic, a boring topic, a gross topic, and make it so engrossing. So they were describing a liposuction. I've never had one before, so it's an area that's completely unfamiliar to me. I also have not looked up any videos on YouTube, because I hope you agree with me, that's not really something that many of us desire to watch. So I'm just going to read through here quickly, and we're going to look at this in two different ways. This will be the last thing we do. So, a powerful piston-like machine is turned on to suck up the fat. Meanwhile, the patient's skin, which is evidently grown accustomed to those fat deposits, is putting up a valiant fight to keep them. This requires several burly assistants to hold the patient down on the table while the surgeon works. In the next hideous scene, fat can be seen moving through the transparent tube. No more than 2,000 cc's are removed at any one time, the doctor says, showing us what looks like an extremely heavy 2-liter soda bottle. The tube is removed, the incision sewn shut, and several miles of gauze is wrapped around the patient to hide the fact that her thighs now look like gallons of ice cream with one scoop taken out. That is a disgusting scene. But, it's interesting because there's so many vivid words in there that are not just telling me what it looks like, but also telling me what to think about it. So imagery is not just description, it's intentional description. So something like up here, powerful piston-like. I can now imagine, maybe some of you understand pistons a bit better than me, but I am thinking of more like Industrial Revolution type of machines, and it's a little more horrifying. Instead of just taking away or getting rid of the fat, it's sucking it up. Much more visual than just remove. Burly assistants. So even giving us this scene and then describing them as burly. So if it had just been assistants, I'll admit I would have thought of it as more just some hygienists or whoever's there. I think about maybe a woman. We think about assistants because we live in a world with implicit bias. But when you say burly, I'm thinking of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, people who are holding people down for electroshock. That's where my brain is going. It suddenly becomes a lot more violent just by adding this term in here. Of course, mentioning emotional stuff, hideous scene, describing the fat moving through the tube, saying it's transparent, made it even more gross to me. It made me try to see it rather than just moving through the tube or goes up the tube. And then this whole section right here, obviously very vivid language, and we're going to talk about that more in a second. So I'll move us over here. Those areas that are, some of those areas of description that are in yellow, piston-like is a simile. So it's an analogy. We don't know what the machine looks like, but now we at least get an idea of its power, or likening it to other larger machines with pistons. These two down here, so the extremely heavy 2-liter soda bottle. I don't know what the container looks like, but I have seen a 2-liter soda bottle. So now I can connect this scene because I have something to latch it onto. Same with down here. I don't know what a person's thighs look like after they get liposuction, but now I do, because I know what a gallon of ice cream with 1 scoop taken out of does look like. And it needs to be said that these are really intentional. They're not just random. And so I was taking writing classes in college, and I thought I was a really good writer, and I was coming up with all these amazing analogies, and they just be such random crap, of like, oh, the dashboard looked like a sub sandwich. I didn't write that, but just something that makes absolutely no sense. However, these make a lot of sense, especially because, like, read the room. This is all about liposuction. People get that if they feel that they are carrying too much weight. What kind of foods make you gain weight? Soda and ice cream, the very foods that could have gotten this person in this situation. So very intentional analogies and metaphors. And then this last one, or not last one, I guess. Actually, we'll look at this one. What do I want to do? Yeah. The patient's skin, which has evidently grown accustomed to those fat deposits, is putting up a valiant fight to keep them. So we know about personification anytime that a idea or thing is treated as human, and it's to force some kind of relationship or sympathy. And so from this, we got that this is not natural. Like, this, it's putting up a fight to keep these fat deposits. So we're not supposed to look at this as some marvel of science. Like, this is a brutal scene, and it just doesn't seem right to be doing, especially because the skin does not want these things to go away. But we use personification a lot without it being obvious. So I think we learn personification when we're taking, like, having to write poetry, and we're like reading Robert Frost, and we have to write something that personifies things around us. And we're like, oh, the fan is, sneezing at me and blowing all of this air on me. So we just sort of do obvious stuff like that. But even terms that we use in economics, something like healing, the housing market's healing, the economy is healing. Those are very human words, but it helps us understand how a housing market bounces back, that much like healing, it takes time. It sort of gets these scabs, and gradually it becomes stronger enough. And the last one is this orange, several miles of gauze. Obviously, it's not miles. That would be a hyperbole, where you're just exaggerating, but it's for the effect of, like, it was so much gauze, which when I read that, I think, how bad was this wound? Why are you doing this, that you need so much gauze? I know it's not miles. However, it definitely adds to this horrific scene that they painted for us. Do I expect you to use all of these? Absolutely not. You're going to notice that as I build my outline, I'm using just a handful of the ones that I see. This is not a really long paper, so you can't cover all of these. There's a lot that were not in my essay, my opinion article. So don't feel like you have to grab at all of them. I want you to have a nice toolbox that you can reach into. I recommend taking some notes about these for yourself so that you can reference them. If you're unclear about any, please let me know. What I'm going to do now is I've uploaded how I annotated. I always do everything on paper. It's easier for me. You don't have to. And this is probably hard to read, which is fine because I'm going to be making a DEJ about this, taking all of these ideas and condensing them. I tried to color code for myself. All the logos is red, pathos is green, and the ethos is blue. Then all the other notes that I found were in in purple. So where we should be now is we should have definitely annotated in some way, have notes. We should have a preliminary DEJ, which you'll be able to see by tonight. I'm going to add to it more and more, but I'll upload the Google Doc so you can see my progress. And then we're going to take the stuff from the DEJ and do some copying and pasting and try to look for areas that seem to have some similarities. And that's how we will build paragraphs. And so that's what we'll do on Thursday. We will not have like an intensive, rhetorical lesson. It's just going to be taking what we've got and then building arguments from there. You'll be able to see the arguments that I've built from this guy. So this paper is a very broken down, just how we create meaning, how we create analysis.